And Professor Tania Ajam is here with us to facilitate the session. They're going to talk more interesting things that we don't want to miss. Please give it up for the beautiful Prof. Tania Ajam. Thank you.
Good morning. You'll see that Vusi has learned that flattery will get you everywhere. I think that this is one of the most important sessions on digital inclusion and digital justice. I'm not going to have a long preamble, but I'm going to ask my first speaker. We'll have Alison Gillwald first, one of the foremost researchers in the area of digital inequality and how we address that, to come forward and share her content with us. I'm really looking forward to it. And then afterwards, we will have online, joining from the UK, Melanie Garson, who you would have seen in the first day as well. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you so much, Tania, and thank you so much for the comments this morning and the generosity of our engagements yesterday. I had so many wonderful young and old people come and speak to me, pick up on issues that we discussed yesterday. It's really wonderful to be able to address you today on some of the things that I mentioned I would yesterday. And just to say, that I have behind this grey hair, lots of fabulous young women in particular, working on these surveys across the continent, in Sudan and Ghana and Ethiopia, and where else have we got? Uganda, and then of course we've got the big South African team, also some fabulous young and old men working on that team as well, but really some fantastic economists working on this work. And it really wouldn't be possible. What I'm presenting today is the result of a lot of work by a lot of other people. So this sort of thing is not working here. So I'm going to stand here so that I can read there. So yesterday I did speak about this digital inequality paradox, and I'm really going to be picking up on some of the issues arising from that and how we address it. And I think just also because the context is data, and I was speaking about data as a public good yesterday and how important this is from a global governance, national governance, regional governance point of view, because data crosses borders and is not a traditionally regulated sector. But fundamental to data is public statistics. This is our classical good, digital public good. And unfortunately, across the world, we have very poor digital data. The ITU has been working on this for 20, 30 years. We are signatories to the Partnership on Artificial Development, the Partnership on Measuring the Information Society, which came out of the WSIS 1 Geneva Plan of Action. And 30 years on, as we're doing the Global Digital Compact, we've actually made very little progress in the Global South. Global North, of course, multiple indexes and statistics on, and surveys on various forms, micro enterprises, all sorts of things, children online, but we have not. But I'm very glad to say, after a lot of effort with a lot of people working globally, we have managed to get into the Global Digital Compact a commitment to the collection of digital indicators, advanced digital indicators, in order to provide an evidence base for policy, and some commitment towards a solidarity fund to do this work. For 20 years, we've been trying to work with Stats SA, we've worked with the Department of Communications and ICASA on trying to get this data for South Africa. As I said, we do work across the continent, partnering with the ITU and with UNCTAD. In fact, the demand-side data from our 14 countries is the basis for the problematic ITU data that's extrapolated across very different 50 plus countries. So I'm just saying this is absolutely something that we've been working on for years. I think probably we had some better data before. I think we've got very big problems with our data right now. But I think the contribution of the household surveys, the individual and household surveys that I'm going to refer to, and the micro-enterprise surveys do fill some of these evidence-based gaps that we have. So just very quickly, because I'm probably not going to get through the magnitude of slides I have, and to ask you please to look at the report, because I'm really not doing justice to it. I have put that, I think, was circulated as part of your resource pack as well. But despite the emphasis on information communication technologies for development in South Africa over the past 30 years since democratic transition, policies have fallen short in fostering equitable digital inclusion. We've had policy failures, policy flip-flops, we've had regulatory failure, and we've had, as a result, market failure from ineffectually regulated markets. Of course, the severe structural inequalities continue to hinder social economic mobility, and these inequalities are reflected in the extent and use of different populations that I'm going to show you now. At the same time, of course, the pandemic exacerbated socioeconomic inequalities by widening the disparities that we see between different users. In fact, what we see during COVID is that the vast majority of South Africans, even though we've got increasing internet access levels, were unable to meaningfully digitally substitute for work, schooling, food security, social grants, those kinds of things. Although I must say the social grant and the social relief provided during COVID compared to the other countries, which we did through horrendous telephonic interviews during COVID, was really very impressive. That's kind of despite the state of our digital thing, not because of it. Of course, I'm referring now to work that's been done over 2 decades across the continent to try and assess public policy and regulatory outcomes in relation to the primary objectives of all of our digital policy across the continent and the globe of promoting affordable provision of dynamic and evolving range of digital services, both in the interests of economic growth and development, but a lot of our work has actually been critiquing traditional growth literature theory and empirical work, really looking at how often when you've got, growth, you've got improved digital indicators, you don't actually necessarily have improved social and economic justice in terms of the outcomes. But basically what we're saying is we need to get in track the strategy around a more effective I thought that was already me. More effective regulated markets. We need to, really push in private sector investments, but towards public objectives. And we need to really be focusing on the fact that a lot of the governance now needs to take place at a national level. I'm going to have to go much quicker than I have, but I just wanted to refer to some of the issues that have been raised yesterday, and also how we could better address some of the digital problems we have. We've got lots of data sitting in different places that we don't use, we don't remove out of our silos and use. But I also want to speak about how in a prepaid mobile market that's changing, over-the-top services market that's not nationally bounded, why administrative data no longer can answer a lot of questions. It can answer some questions, continues to answer some supply-side questions. It really is unable to answer very basic questions like how many unique subscribers you have in your country, how many individuals actually have access to the internet, and I'll show you some issues with that. But we do have administrative data. This comes obviously from operators, and it's collected and very often not administratively audited, so we just accept the data. A lot of the data operators have managed to persuade ICASA confidential. In the postal service, the private operators just don't respond to ICASA at all. So this, for a regulated sector, the administrative data is very problematic. Okay, let me leave that. Obviously, over the last few years, a lot of emphasis on big data, how we can basically close up our, stats offices and our big household survey. We can all go, big data is going to be the solution. It's not. It can't. It can do all sorts of things. There are a whole lot of things it can't do. Big data used, mobility data used for transport planning, very, very interesting examples all over the world. You can know that a whole lot of people are moving from a rural area to a schooling area or something like that. You don't know, using that SIM data, if their age, their income, if they're men or women, and what they're going to be doing there. So lots of potential there with sensors, cut a lot of costs, but it's got to be used in a complementary way. National statistics, Absolutely essential. The only way we can get this data. The problem, and I'll show you in a moment with our data in South Africa, is that we're not using international indicators. We are blurring definitions. As a result, some of our broad statistics correlate with the demand-side data, and of course we get very, very useful provincial breakdown data, which we don't get from our nationally representative surveys. It cost us 10 million rand to do it instead of 1.5. So basically, and we were working very closely with the Stats SA and also on the satellite accounts a few years. We were trying to get if we just had another 5 questions in the national census or in the household survey, we could actually answer a whole set of big policy questions through sort of cross-referencing and things. So basically, the problem is that without timely and high-quality demand-side data on access and use, not only will there be a serious misalignment between policy and priorities and needs of South Africans, but this will particularly result in further marginalizing further marginalizing those who aren't aligned. And I'll show you why that happens. As I said, very important. I haven't got time to spend on this, but there were a lot of questions about regional variations around access to the internet. So this breakdown on the data is very, very interesting. I haven't looked at the weightings and all sorts of things, but it's interesting that the overall figure for basically what comes down to internet access by mobile internet access. Okay, I've got another 5 minutes, and I've got the whole presentation to do. So I'm just going to you can have a look at those. Obviously, the provincial thing is very useful. Administrative data's ICASA supply-side report, as I said, very useful figures on revenues and things, because it's all disaggregated, because the operators, some of them who are listed, some of them who all know each other's data anyway, won't allow for this data to be disaggregated. It's useful as aggregated data, but it's not really useful in understanding some of the competitive conditions and those kinds of things. So for a supply-side analysis, we just have very descriptive data. I'll show you the problems with these prepaid data. Basically the same for all those years, whereas there actually are important variations that we see. But also this data is completely fluctuating. I'll show you the RAMP index, which we're collecting quarterly information from across 50 countries in Africa, and you can see how dynamic that actually is. So this data, we could do something far more interesting with the supply-side analysis. There is coverage data and quite nice broken down coverage data in the ICASA study. But the main challenge that we're facing across the continent is that we have 99, 100% coverage, a little bit less in some rural areas, but various countries, Rwanda, Lesotho, smaller countries that have Ghana, for example, 100% coverage, 99, whatever percent coverage. Rwanda, that kind of coverage, and yet you only have 15% of the population with internet things. So when everybody puts the gold stars on Rwanda, when the bank does its poster child stuff, you actually have to look at what's happening on the ground. You might have all these frameworks and things in place, but do people have access to the internet? No. And that's because it's connected to GDP per capita, basically, if you're looking at just the numbers, but it's connected to levels of development and, of course, particularly education. So we've got this coverage. Supply-side problems, still some, but it's mainly a demand-side challenge we're facing. Even though people have access, they cannot afford the devices, they don't have the education to use those devices or to pay for those services in ways that could improve their livelihoods. Not got time to do the RAMP index, but you could use this, ICASA could use this more effectively in trying to do their supply-side analysis. This has been done for over 10 years now, incredible longitudinal data or time series data on pricing and what has happened. The main point I want to make is that we need to look at these very, very closely. Ghana's doing incredibly, on a whole lot of scores, and you'll see a lot of it is based on the fact that they've got these very high levels of good outputs on primary education. But just to say, we just need to be careful what we're comparing with here. We're basically looking at 1 gigabyte of data, and that is very different things. In some countries, we're actually looking at 2G, in some countries, we're looking at 4G, etc. So this is always very qualified by analysis. And just to say, South Africa is there. price of data is too high. It's too high for our citizens. Most citizens in Africa can't afford GSM services. We basically need to be looking at alternatives for those who are not online. Those who are not online in South Africa can't afford those services, look just like the vast majority of Africans in other countries. Our 25%, 30% look just like the 90% that I was referring to, or 85% I was referring to in Rwanda. But South Africa does have extremely high quality services, very comprehensive coverage. So you need to understand what you're comparing. And those investments that have occurred in our networks are a very powerful, positive outcome of our training. Okay, I haven't got time to deal with this, very sadly, but I just wanted to say that a lot of our efforts during COVID provided better cost services to people who were already online. But we did nothing online. We did nothing to bring more people online during COVID. In fact, we lost people who could no longer afford services. So let me quickly go to the demand-side context, because I think this is very important. Sorry, on the slide there was meant to be a reference to the report, the after-access report, the post-COVID state of digital in South Africa. But basically what we see here is that as we move, get greater internet access, the shift from the cost of the device being the main barrier and the cost of data being the main barrier to use becomes issues of awareness. The people now, the long tail or the end tail of the people who are not online are people who have very low levels of education. They're either not aware of what the internet is or they don't know how to use it. So those figures have grown quite significantly. 2018 was the telephone survey that I mentioned, and 2022 is the after-access survey that was done. Just in terms of device ownership, basically the actual mobile phone, we're very, very high now. Computer ownership remains very low because smartphones is the way most people are accessing the internet. And then, as I said, there's a notable increase in adoption between 2018 and 2022, but this is an increase that we can see was happening anyway, because, as I said, there were no particular interventions to get people online. And of that 71%, as I said, a very large number of people are now just connected. They even have smartphones. When you look at the SME survey, they have smartphones, but they're actually not using them for anything more than WhatsApp or something like that, those kind of internet services. Yeah, let me just, so that was the inequalities thing. So importantly, to look at the gender figures, gender inequality in smartphone ownership has been eliminated, probably even reversed. We've got negative correlation. Location inequalities still exist. This is important when we also look at usage. So broadly, very, very broadly, and this was the contribution of this research sort of several years ago that was caused quite a lot of stuff with the time that the world was actually saying that there's an increase in gender disparities. It's not what our data was showing. What our data was showing is that basically men and women of a similar education have similar access and use. They don't do the same things with that, but they have similar access and use. These nuances, this presentation of this disaggregated data that can only be done as a result of these nationally representative surveys. This is the only way that we can do these regressions and modeling that allows us to highlights the lack of heterogeneity. These groups, when they're aggregated, across South Africa, for example, they mask the extreme inequalities that we actually have in those categories. So, in many ways, poorer, rural men and women are going to have more in common from a digital point of view than women across the whole spectrum. And the other important thing is the significance of geographic location. So basically what this research does, and I think I've missed out a critical slide, which you should look at, especially for the statistical nerds who want to look at the methodology and unpick it and unpack it. But the important part of this is that, I've just forgotten the point I was going to make. Anyway, we'll come back to it. But the important part of this is that we are looking at this in relation to our conceptual framework of inequality and looking at intersectional inequality. So we're trying to understand the most marginalized at the intersections of obviously class, race, and gender traditionally, but applying that to a statistical thing, looking at gender, location, income, education, etc. And what we notice is that, in fact, the urban-rural gap is more significant than the gender gap. And of course, when you put these together and you're looking at, intersectional inequality, obviously women, when we look at the data, women, not obviously, when we look at the data, women in rural areas are in fact, most marginalized in terms of those characteristics. So this is a very interesting slide in the sense that we speak a lot about digital skills. UNDP measures on digital readiness, many of these indexes that you will have looked at, look at output from primary school as a measure of basic digital literacy. For many, many years, over the last 20 years, we've been engaging with the UN on this. In our original surveys going back, well, not original surveys, but our surveys going back about 10 years, we actually found that in Africa that the kind of basic digital levels and skills that we needed were only seeing them at tertiary level. So once people were actually going to university and getting access to computers and training, they were in exposure, they were actually getting the kind of basic skills that we needed. What we do see is an increase in that, or reduction in that level over the few years. So actually, people at high school are actually beginning to get those skills now, which is a very positive thing. But I think what is really interesting about this compared to other countries is that despite more money being spent on education in South Africa than anywhere else on the continent, and in fact many parts of the world, we're not seeing the quality of basic education that's kind of feeding into these other levels. So if you look here, for example, education attainment level, as a share of the population, we've got 43% who are actually already achieving secondary training, but only 14% that have had tertiary training from the survey. Whereas, if you're looking at Ghana, who are doing fantastically, enormous growth, just on a number of scores, doing very, very well, you can see that although they've got still 22% who have no education, they've got this very big tertiary education figure, which obviously means that people are better placed. The pipeline, you don't just produce data scientists at the end, you've got to have that pipeline. And then just looking at South Africa's internet access, basically, as I said, very positive, up to 75%. And in that, we've seen an elimination of the gender gap, that we need to plug into that and see where the problems still are, and a reducing gap between rural and urban areas. And I wanted to make some points here in relation to Estonia, but I don't think I'll have time, but maybe we can come back to them, of why it's so much more challenging for us to implement these systems. And a lot of it goes to the structural inequalities, of course, but also issues around education and the highly meritocratic bureaucracies that many of these successful digital states have. Okay, I'm going to have to move on. This is the important point about people during COVID not being able to do something. So we do see an increase in digital activity due to COVID, but this did not result in more households obtaining dedicated household internet connection, which would enable digital engagement. So for a lot of people who were accessing the internet through public Wi-Fi, which we'd made some progress on, not enough and not what we were meant to, but we'd made some progress before COVID. Many people, of course, during lockdown had no access to school, the main places where they are accessing the internet or accessing bandwidth with their device. Okay, so sorry, this was the main slide that I thought was going to be higher up, but just to, maybe because it will summarize, I think I probably have to end off now. But the importance of these, of us doing these digital surveys, and then, we can have a few key indicators that we then check against the household survey between these very expensive surveys that we're doing now 3 years through the goodwill or the taxpayers of Canada, or now this is the Bill and Melinda Gates funded this year, or Sweden, historically. So this econometric modeling of the core drivers of digital access revealed that income and education are the main determinants, with age also becoming very evident. So the Logit model is developed to assess the core drivers of these dimensions of digital access, mainly mobile phone ownership, internet access, and financial inclusion. I haven't even included the financial inclusion. The survey has got information on platform work, it's got cybersecurity awareness, it's got privacy awareness, data protection awareness. So it's much broader than this. I'm just looking at the basic ones. I've got to end off, so I'm going to just quickly finish this. This allows for consideration, as I mentioned, of that intersectionality or intersectional inequality, which is present and very significant when we look at the more granular data. Income was significant across all access measures, with higher income levels associated with higher probability of access. Household wealth and education, we also do a household asset assessment, which is very useful for analysis. Significant for internet access and financial inclusion only. Age was observed to be negatively associated with mobile phone ownership and internet access. And once all factors are controlled for, geographic location is only significant for internet access, highlighting that location gaps in financial inclusion are driven by other inequalities, such as income and education. So we've got these fundamental inequalities. Just have a look at this, because we have to end, but this basically, the survey goes into very great depth, with able to show some of the census data of where people are accessing the internet, what they're actually doing on the internet, and of course most of it's driven by social networking. And you can have a look at these, the actual breakdowns on that, as they've changed, especially between 2018 and 2019, very interesting. And then also just to point out, we do have the only demand-side data on the continent, with this big push towards digital identification of how people are actually experiencing, whether they actually have digital identities or not. And of course, those are very different. I haven't got time for the micro-enterprise survey, but it's very important because it basically looks like the bottom end, the lower LSMs of our society, and there are enormous gender discrepancies within that. But basically, this is a very bleak picture. Our micro-enterprises, this was done with part of a World Bank study of the 7 countries that I mentioned, very, very low levels of digital adoption. So, and there's proposals around how we need to address this. We need to address this to build, post-COVID economic reconstruction. Sorry for going over.
Thanks, Alison. I feel very bad about curtailing such an interesting and informative presentation. If you've got any questions or comments for Alison, please do it online. And I'm going to ask Vusi to please make sure that Alison has access to those questions. We'll then take Melanie's presentation, and you will also have an opportunity to pose questions to her online, and then I will ask them to just pick a few and respond. So if we can get Melanie Garson from the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change online, so that she can give her presentation. I found one thing that was very interesting about Alison's presentation is that it didn't mention race. And as we know, in South Africa, we don't only have spatial divides between urban and rural, and economic divides between rich and poor. It's also very much racial. And the latest statistic I could find was on the global, General Household Survey, StatsSA 2019. And what it said was that of households headed by white persons, 50.5% of them have access to the internet at home, whereas only 3.8% of households headed by an African person. So our global access numbers for the country look great, but when you ask whether there's meaningful access, whether there's access at home so that kids can study and people can work from home, then we can see that those aggregate figures mark huge divides. This is our next eminent speaker. She spoke on the first day, and we welcome her back. So it's over to you, Melanie. You have 15 minutes.
Okay, I'm hoping I'll last 15 minutes. Good morning, everybody. My battery on my computer, talking about everything else, is about to go. So I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as possible. Building on what we just heard, I'm actually going to talk about the other side of the digital divide, or potential digital divide, and that's the access to compute. Now, this is back in 2022, we began to see with the rise of models that there was going to be a challenge as companies and countries were invested in large-scale compute, that this wasn't going to be evenly distributed. We want to get a handle of what that divide was going to look like. So just, thinking about, as I say, the other thing about compute is a lot more about chips. It's about being able to process or store kind of data at scale. It involves the hardware, the software, and the infrastructure in the data centers that let everything run together. And what we've seen is like exponential growth, and these falling costs have caused this rapid acceleration that, as we're seeing, large-scale compute models are proliferating around us all the time. And so building on what I talked about yesterday, some of the processes we're talking about, AI-enabled government, this was relying on large-scale compute capabilities, beginning to make that the agent of model change, and thinking of how that's going to really benefit governments when they do it. But we began to see that access to compute is beginning to be a bottleneck, and AI chips are massively expensive, in short supply. We're already seeing that in the system with the recent NVIDIA announcement that their Blackwell chip is going to be delayed despite massive investments of waiting for it. So beginning to see that what is the state of compute was really significant to us. And what was also becoming clear, that companies or private investors are really pulling away in that, while states are not staying up to speed. And that creates also a massive vacuum, because in the sense that if you're not able to access the large-scale compute capabilities through your country or through your government, through services are enabled in country, you're going to have to go to private resources to do that. And that opens up another inequality within the system. And so this was our thinking behind this, was alongside the many other factors that are going to sort of reinforce divides, access to compute is going to be one of them. And what does that picture begin to look like? And you can't really deal with the problem until you measure it. There hadn't been, although there've been some studies of compute for AI, and more recently there's been a little bit more sort of focus on large-scale compute, there hadn't at that point been a real in-depth look at what is this state. And we don't just mean it to sort of like have you built compute, but where there's possible access to it via a neighbor, or what that picture looks like. Now, it's difficult to measure. Companies are often secretive about their purchases. It's difficult to track the supply chain of chips. Countries are increasingly secretive now over the last few months. China's stopped reporting much of its data. There's little country strategies about building monitoring compute use. And we still don't understand the implications of it. So what we started with last year, and we're actually in the process of building the second version of this, which will be released in November, but I do urge everyone to go have a look at the report, is that we looked at 55 countries across 25 indicators to try and get sort of picture of what this looks like. And indicators come from structural indicators through to governance indicators. And what we began to see is this global digital compute divide is stark. And I just said one thing about the index, was the purpose of the index was not to do a 1 to 55. That was not ever the intention. It was not entirely useful. The purpose of the index, from our point of view and how we work with government, is really to see where are countries in their journey, what are the levers that they have, where should governments place investment. There are countries that have bought a supercomputer but have no compute ecosystem around it, so that computer, single supercomputer lies fallow in a basement somewhere unplugged. So it's really thinking about what are the levers, where are countries in their journey, where can they really double down and invest in to actually accelerate their compute journey. So what we saw that it was pretty stark, and where countries lead on, massive gap on where countries lead on data science and build. 50% of those countries we looked at had not invested in any quantum computing infrastructure. 70% of the most powerful computers are restricted into basically 3 countries. And thinking about this access to compute, so it's not just about you have the infrastructure, but whether it's the agreements are in place for researchers to access those computers. Even if they don't have it in their own country, only 35% of the countries we surveyed actually had that in place. Now, bearing in mind, these are including OECD countries. These are, it's not just looking at countries where we didn't expect there to be compute. Access to leading cloud infrastructure becomes a big part of the problem, and only 23% of the countries on the index had that kind of cloud service optimized for machine learning. 47% of the countries did not have any access deals in place. And also what we began to see was that across different indicators, the compute divide is not just global, it's regional as well on different indicators. So for instance, the availability of compute training programs in parts of Europe are also lacking, and where we see, massive gaps. For instance, in Asia, where Singapore has a huge
of a nursery rhyme that I learned when I was a child. There was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good. But when she was bad, she was hard. And I think that that's exactly how technology is. While we're waiting to get Melanie back online, I want to ask Alison, have you managed to pick up any comments? And if you could just come forward and read the questions and comments and respond to those that you think most relevant. We obviously won't have time to deal with them all. And in the interim, I'm hoping that we'll be able to get Melanie back online. Over to you, Alison.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I'm visually challenged with this little text. There was a question around, sorry, I just had it up and now it's, sorry, there was a question around the data prices and why data prices. Sorry, I can't call your name, but maybe when we come back to this, we can do that. Is it connected? No. Okay, then I'm just going to carry on.
Please go ahead.
Yes. So the question was why, South Africa's prices, even sometimes I think with the, continental operators are higher than in other countries. The first point I was just making about that is we need to really make sure we're comparing apples with apples. So very few African countries have, for example, the 5G penetration that South Africa has. Very few countries even have 4G as comprehensively as we do. So the quality of our service is much, much greater. And people's, the importance of the quality of service is really indicative in the figures that have shown that as the now effectively duopoly operators, as the dominant operators, Vodacom and MTN, have invested in these networks. They've effectively, captured this market in terms of quality. The late entrants have been in this, a vicious cycle of not being able to get the customers in order to invest in those networks. And even at the height of the data must fall protests, people were leaving the lower cost Cell C and telecom services and migrating to and churning to Vodacom and MTN. So if people have any discretion, they are willing to pay for quality. And those, of course, have just let those networks get on and on, stronger and stronger. And just to explain why those prices are so high is that they've been ineffectually regulated. ICASA was meant to do in terms of the ECA Act. Now, 15 years ago, I think the market review that was meant to, that was done several times, including RIA did it one round, where the remedies were never implemented, that required wholesale access regulation on ICASA in order to allow the late entrants to get cost-based, with profit, of course, for the incumbents or the dominant operators, price. So we've had ineffectual regulation there. The market review, which is a key trigger in the competition lever in the ECA Act, has not been implemented over those years. As I said, there was now a final one done a few years ago, but the remedies have never been implemented because the operators have had such a strong lobby at getting API access, direct wholesale access into their networks, cost-based access into their networks. They've just gone on to be stronger and stronger. The others have got more marginalized. The importance of that wholesale access regulation, which is documented in evidence all over the globe with, through economic regulation, is that when you do this, when you do the retail mandatory cost reductions that we saw with the Competition Commission just before COVID. Everybody thought they were connected to COVID when you look at things internationally, but in fact they'd come in just before COVID. When you get that retail price mandatory reduction or ceiling or floor, it's actually it distorts the market. It distorts what the market was doing. What the effect of it was is that it brought down MTN and Vodacom's prices to Cell C and Telkom's prices. And those few customers that they had a kind of price advantage on and could actually retain were now, it was not competitive. People were going to the Vodacom network. So they brought it down another 10 Rand. But effectively, what the mandatory price reductions, although they did provide relief for those who were already online, didn't do anything for those who aren't online. It didn't actually service Cell C and MTN. We've basically been in a market exit activity ever since then. So the prices, why they're different in different countries is because they've got different regulatory regimes, they're differently regulated, many of them not very well regulated in many regimes, and often in many countries there's a kind of competitive price war. There was before we've had a lot of concentration in the market that drove prices very, very low. And so what you were actually seeing at those top countries with a very low data was actually very poor internet quality, not in all cases, and not the case now currently with Ghana. But just measuring that price and giving it as that figure completely hides the complexity of the economic regulation in order to get a working competitive market in a country, which we have not done.